As someone whose Devil May Cry experience had just started recently, there was one thing I'd always heard about when fans discussed the series as a whole: skip Devil May Cry 2. Needless to say, after recently completing Devil May Cry 1 and being pleasantly surprised by the series' origins, I was a little nervous yet incredibly curious to try it out. Is it as bad as they say? Is it a good sequel to the first game? Let's find out as we dive into the second part of a 6-part series where I document my experience with each Devil May Cry title. My name's Johnny Bueno, and this is How Bad Could It Be? A Devil May Cry 2 review.
Good grief. They really made a big mess, didn't they?
I'm just gonna be upfront here. Devil May Cry 2's story sucks. The story is told in an incredibly disjointed way, and the game's introduction leaves you with very little to go off of, unlike the first game in the series. While Devil May Cry 1's plot was simple, its events were at least connected in a way that makes sense. Devil May Cry 2 has you jumping from location to location with no transition in between and no meaningful dialogue. Here's a quick summary of what's going on in this game. Dante meets a woman named Lucia, the game's other playable character, who then takes him to meet her mother? Grandma? Who aided Dante's father Sparta in defeating the demon Argosax once upon a time. In present day, Arius, who runs the Ouroboros Corporation, seeks to absorb Argosax's power through the use of 4 relics, or arcanas. The two protagonists then split up, with Dante heading to defeat Arius, while Lucia searches for the arcanas. That's really all there is to it, and the game doesn't bother to take it anywhere beyond that as you travel to locations like Gloomy Town, Rundown Factory, and Fancy Building with no real connecting points. Speaking of locations, they're all empty and lifeless, and have a color palette that almost entirely consists of muted browns and grays. The town at the start of the game particularly suffers from this feeling of emptiness, where they seemingly attempted to evoke the same Gothic-style setting from Devil May Cry 1, but this time with far less character. The locations are much larger and more open now, but with nothing meaningful to fill all of that extra space, I ended up feeling like each area was a slog to run through, especially when there's backtracking involved. Credit where credit is due though, they did try to expand the overall setting of the game compared to its predecessor, but the execution was just incredibly poor. Dante's personality did a complete 180 from the first game, and now he has become much more stoic and stone-faced, rather than the fun, smack-talking son of Sparta that I grew to love after completing Devil May Cry 1. I felt like they completely stripped him of what actually made him likable and instead turned him into a generic early 2000s tough guy main character. Devil May Cry 2's villain Arius doesn't even have any real build-up, so by the time I got to him I was so uninvested in the game's plot I couldn't help but laugh at some of his goofier lines and see him more as a comic relief than an actual threat. Much like Arius, I was totally uninvested in Lucia as well, even as she was the game's other playable character. Again, there's so little meaningful dialogue and things just kind of happen with no connecting points, so Lucia's role in the plot and her identity struggle ended up falling completely flat. At least for Dante, he had an entire previous game to flesh out his backstory, but as a newcomer, I was given no real reason to care for Lucia. Mathieu though, she's perfect. I wouldn't change a thing.
Too easy.
Devil May Cry 2 is similar to the previous title, where you'll be fighting through many levels and earning a grade at the end of each one, anywhere from D to S. You're then granted a sum of red orbs based on your performance during the level, which is the game's currency for upgrading weapons and purchasing items. One thing that I actually found to be an improvement over Devil May Cry 1 was the mission length. Most missions in the game are much more consistent in their length compared to the first game, where some missions took only a minute or two to complete. It ain't much, but hey, there are some things that Devil May Cry 2 did get right. The game structure is somewhat different from the first title in that the game also features a second protagonist in Lucia. You'll be taken through 18 missions as Dante and 13 missions as Lucia, both offering a very similar experience to one another. You can honestly get the gist of the entire game just by playing Dante's story, which only took me a little over 2 hours to complete. I consider this a positive, as it meant I didn't have to spend too much time with this game. Our good friend the fixed camera makes a return from the first game as well, and it once again does a great job of hiding enemies so they can snipe you from off screen. I also found the camera to be straight up nauseating at times, especially when I was trying to quickly run by enemies. One massive letdown was the weapons, particularly the melee weapons. While Dante and Lucia can collect several different weapons for their arsenal, all melee weapons were effectively the same, with the only differences between them being their reach, power, and speed. Spending red orbs to upgrade them doesn't even grant new combos like in the first game, it simply upgrades their power. Gone were the unique weapons and weapon combos from Devil May Cry 1. What Devil May Cry 2 gave us for melee weapons was completely watered down and stripped of all personality, much like our now awkwardly stoic protagonist himself. This left me feeling like it didn't matter what melee weapon I picked, and I didn't even care when I found a new one because I just stuck with both characters' default weapons, which were more than enough to finish the game.
That's just a piece of crap.
The first thing that became apparent to me with Devil May Cry 2's combat was how they went a completely different direction with how you perform melee combos. Combos being determined by how you delay your melee strikes from the first game is no longer a thing. Now, combos are determined by which direction you push the analog stick between each strike. This, combined with how much slower the combat feels, left me scratching my head as it felt so fluid in the first game, so why flip it on its head? To make the combat even more awkward, these combos can only be performed while not being manually locked onto an enemy through holding R1. While the game will automatically lock onto enemies for you, as shown by the purple reticule, holding R1 will put Dante in a type of ready stance where he can only perform his stinger ability to close the gap or knock enemies into the air. No other moves could be performed while manually locked on, which added to the clunkiness of the overall melee combat experience and made performing combos feel much less fluid. But enough about the melee weapons. How are the ranged weapons? Well, compared to melee weapons, they're broken, especially the starting weapons for both Dante and Lucia due to their rapid-fire nature. You see, not only can they dish out decent, quick damage, they can also stagger enemies with each shot. You can now stand on one side of the screen spraying bullets, or knives if you're playing Lucia, at a mob of enemies, and they won't even be able to reach you. Even if they did, the enemies in the game are so passive it's almost like they don't even want to hit you. But more on that soon. As I progressed through the game, I found that I could attempt to string together some awkward melee combos to rack up enough style points for a high combo score. Or I could just hold square and let Ebony and Ivory do all the work. And honestly, that pretty much sums up the Devil May Cry 2 combat experience. Just hold square and you'll be fine. Even for Lucia, who admittedly does have some more interesting acrobatic style melee combos, holding square is just so much more optimal. There were actually some positives to Devil May Cry 2's combat, namely the addition of a dedicated dodge button, Circle, which was a very welcome change from my perspective as dodges were much more awkward to perform in the first game. Maybe it was just me, but I also felt like spam dodging was faster than running, so that's how I got around most of the levels. One weird downside to the addition of a dodge button was the inclusion of wall running. Both are tied to the same button, so when you're near a wall, you'll perform a wall run as opposed to a dodge. Wall running felt completely pointless though, and the only times I used it were by accident when I was dodge rolling but was too close to a wall. Another nice little change is the ability to swap range weapons on the fly with R2. No longer do you need to pause in the middle of combat to open the menu and swap out your range weapon, although part of me misses the fun little animation you got every time you did.
Now, kill me. It's your job to hunt devils.
I mentioned earlier that the enemies in Devil May Cry 2 were passive, but I don't think that quite details how much they literally do not want to hit you. I found that a lot of the times enemies further away from me would stand around and do nothing, while the ones near me would take their sweet time to muster up the courage and strike me. These encounters really took the action out of the game's alleged action combat and made the enemies feel more like striking dummies than actual threats to me as the player. One frustrating point with the enemy and boss design is the overuse of flying enemies. Many of them just sat outside of range, leaving me unable to perform any melee combos and forcing me to rely on range weapons. This, combined with the sheer power of range weapons, made me feel like the developers were encouraging me to not even bother attempting to whack the enemies with a sword. This applies to bosses as well, with notable encounters like the infested chopper and the absolutely egregious Trismagia fight where they spend 90% of the encounter out of reach. Devil May Cry 2 does admittedly have more boss variety compared to Devil May Cry 1, though most, if not all of them, fall incredibly flat due to most bosses being just as passive as any other enemy. Dante's first boss fight with Orangera is a perfect example of this. I accidentally managed to get the boss stuck between two pillars, and he did absolutely nothing to get himself out, so I just sprayed him with bullets without consequence. The first encounter with the game's main villain offers a similar experience, especially when fighting him as Lucia. He'll literally just sit there and let you pelt him with knives while he drinks a glass of wine and acts smarmy like he's really doing something. The fight with Bulwark during Dante's story might be the only boss in the game that could be considered anywhere near a good boss fight. It actually reminded me a little bit of the Nello Angelo fight from Devil May Cry 1, where the boss has fairly telegraphed attacks that require some precise timing to dodge. Unfortunately, Bulwark is accompanied by two wolves that will spend most of the fight rocketing around the boss arena and ruining what could have been a good one-on-one fight. Also, shout out to the infested tank, which may be the most unintuitive boss fight in the entire game.
No. Devils never cry.
But
To sum up my experience with Devil May Cry 2, let's take a look at what the game did well, spoiler alert, there ain't much, and what aspects of the game drag it down. For the positives, a dedicated dodge button was a welcome addition to the series that was sorely needed in the first game. The wider boss variety compared to the first game was nice to see as well. The ability to play as multiple characters was a good addition that I know only gets better as the series progresses. Mathieu. For the negatives, the plot is somehow worse than Devil May Cry 1, which was basic but easy to follow. Dante's personality shift is generic and uninteresting. The setting is bland with empty and lifeless levels. The game is far less challenging than Devil May Cry 1 due to how passive enemies are and how much you need to rely on ranged weapons. Most bosses are simple and are just as passive as standard enemies. Combat is slow and stiff and lacks any feeling of fluidity. The upgrade system is unintuitive, only offering increases in power and not new abilities or combos. And melee weapons are all essentially the same with no variations in combat style. So I ask again, is Devil May Cry 2 really that bad? Yes it is. It's actually worse than I thought, and I think I now understand why fans of the series tell people to skip this one. I do feel like it's worth experiencing at least once, just to get the full picture of why that sentiment towards this game exists. Luckily, you could easily complete both Dante and Lucia's story in a few hours, so you could play through it in an afternoon and never touch it again. Now, with 2 Devil May Cry games under my belt, I'm beyond excited for what comes next. With Devil May Cry 3 being one of the most beloved games in the series, I'm desperately looking forward to washing the taste of Devil May Cry 2 out of my mouth. Join me next time as I dive into Devil May Cry 3, the savior of the series. And if you enjoyed this video, give it a like and please let me know what you think in the comments below. I plan on covering all 6 Devil May Cry games in the series, so subscribe if you want to see more, and thanks for watching.